Without the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chances, putting his king into such a sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placid by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check! I should hardly think that he's come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pot's a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only two houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Toot, toot," a cough gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major took hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly as his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, and the little family circled regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes, doughty deeds of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was asleep of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to the India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and signing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paws of something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White, curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor's absent-minded put his empty glass to his lips and then it set it down. His host filled it for him again. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his back, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket. He proffered it. Mrs. White drew back in a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show the fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that three separate men could each have three wishes from it. The soldier regarded him the way the middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have three wishes granted? Mrs. White asked. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his three wishes. Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first two were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your three wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale. Some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterwards. If you could have another three wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and dangling in between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it up the threw it upon the fire. White, with slight cry, stooped down and snatched it up. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame for me what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for the 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket. and all three burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the alarm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment, Soldiers' Adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guests, just in time to catch the last ring, we shan't, we shan't make much out of it. "Did you give anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," said he, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made it. I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can be an henpecked." He darted around the table, pursued by the malign Mrs. White, armed with an anti-macassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200, then. That's all, just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat mirred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized up on him. And he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant. To his fears seemed to have a natural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and the walls, until with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief and the failure of the talisman, crept back to, to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but sat silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A chair creaked, and a squeaky mouse squirred noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and striking one, went downstairs of a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock came, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat?" said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in the bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing, and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Calm down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect allied, fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found a monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side. And then, to the gate beyond, the street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.